Hey, Deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments from my videos from the past 2 weeks. Let's get to it. Apology Deep Dive, Chapter 4 Intro, Donald Trump Analysis. Pamela says, would love for you to talk about the Darrell Brooks trial. Dying to hear your thoughts on what is going on in his brain. Yeah, I've watched a little bit of it and thought I might have some things to say. I'm not sure, though, but I might get into it. Apology Deep Dive, Chapter 5 Intro, Taylor Swift Analysis. Ms. Violet says, if someone has never apologized to you for something that was extremely traumatizing, is it okay to not be okay with them? Is it healthy? I guess my gauge of what is healthy needs some guidance. Yeah, I go into this in detail in my deep dive on apologies, specifically forgiveness. Forgiveness can mean a lot of different things. So my definition of forgiveness, and there are many definitions, but my working definition in the clinical world, and I find this to be the most helpful definition, is an intentional process. So you're going down a road intentionally. It's not something people just do quickly, particularly with big transgressions. So forgiveness is intentional, and it's a process that eventually results in, you understand, it doesn't just happen automatically. It might take a while. It might take 20 years to eventually, it might take 2 seconds, but it depends. That eventually results at a decision, and that's important as well, that people decide to forgive. It's not something that you're supposed to do or something that's imposed on you or just happens naturally. You actually have to make a choice internally to end one's negative attitude and feelings toward the transgressor. So an individual has committed a transgression upon you, and you engage in an intentional process, because the process could mean a lot of different things, and I go into it all in my deep dive. There's a lot of different steps and phases and things to consider. People don't just go, I forgive, especially for big transgressions. So it's an intentional process that eventually results in a decision. So the process of forgiveness is a process that leads to the decision of the ultimate forgiveness step, which is to end one's negative attitude and feelings, meaning that you no longer think ill or bad, or you're angry at the person about what they did. You're no longer having those feelings anymore. And for a lot of people, for big transgressions, you can't just simply make that choice because your body isn't going to go along with it. It's sort of like if you're hungry and you haven't eaten in 3 days, you can't just make a choice to not be hungry. Your body is still hungry. You can delude yourself into thinking that you no longer are hurt and angry about a transgression. You could tell yourself that, but it doesn't mean that it's true. Your body has its emotional reaction, but there's a process that we go through that might eventually lead to the ability to change those feelings. I'm trying to avoid the word let go because that has a lot of bad connotations. And the caveats about forgiveness that I have in my deep dive is that the process of forgiveness, one can go down that road and make that choice regardless of the transgressor asking for it or even deserving it. So you can forgive someone even if they haven't really apologized to you. But of course, apologies can make it easier. You can also forgive internally, or you can express it to the transgressor, meaning that you can forgive inside yourself and never even tell the transgressor, or you can tell them. So yeah, I go into the whole thing, and forgiveness is not necessarily forgetting. It's not necessarily excusing or pardoning or letting go or condoning or minimizing or maybe even reconciling with the person or suppressing anger. Anyway, so for you, Ms. Violets, for you to say, is if someone has never apologized to you for something that was extremely traumatizing, is it okay to, well, I didn't even catch that part. So they've never apologized to you. Is it okay to not be okay with them? Yeah, I would say that it's not only not okay, it's not only okay to not be okay with someone that traumatized you who never apologized, but I would say that it's normal and I think just. But in our society and in some religions, unfortunately, they will say that you're wrong, that you're sinning, or you're holding on to anger. And I'm just like, now, what do we do with that anger? Do we let it ruin our lives? And there are a lot of benefits to going down the road of forgiveness. With clients that I've worked with that have had a lot of traumas, I don't just say you should forgive, but I do introduce the topic, and they might go down that road. Again, it could take 20 years, but And it doesn't just involve you letting go of your emotions. It involves perhaps getting a lot of support, being able to vent about what you went through, being validated. And once you have all of that fulfilled, then you might be able, and grieving, there's a lot of grief that goes through these processes. And then at the end of that road, you might be like, you know what? I think I don't want to hold on to this anger anymore because I feel emotionally and attachment-wise fulfilled. But that's often left out. People are just like, you're just supposed to forgive. Anyway. All right, someone emailed in, anonymous listener. She says, I was watching a recent episode on Natalie. I had a friend who got triggered by someone's comment, but she refused to acknowledge that the comment hurt her. Meanwhile, she became more and more upset while venting about it. I was wondering that if you detect something like this, is it rude to proceed as if your opinion is true and treat them accordingly? End of email. It depends, right? So if you have a friend that is obviously triggered or upset or hurt or angry or something, and you say to them, oh, okay, well, you're obviously triggered or you're obviously upset or you seem affected by that, and they just completely deny it, what are you supposed to do? Well, I think that it's tempting to want to be right in a situation like that, right? To be like, no, you are wrong. You are triggered. I can see it. What's wrong with you? I'm just trying to help you. Will you let me help you? And I can't help you unless you admit that you are angry about something. I understand it. It's fine. There's a temptation there, but there's a lot of reasons why people deny being upset. In fact, I would, in my anecdotal experience, most people by default, even healthy people, will deny that they're affected by things. It takes a lot of differentiation and maturity and wisdom to be able to very quickly acknowledge that you're hurt by someone. I noticed this throughout my career. As someone early in my career that really just identified that hurt feelings were at the core of most issues in life, regardless of individual therapy, couple therapy, family therapy, that I would see it and ask about it or observe it, and 99% of the time people are like, I'm not hurt. What are you talking about? I don't get hurt by things. I'm frustrated, or I'm cool, I'm chill. We have this idea that you're supposed to always be chill and cool and above it all, and it's just like it's just not possible. So it's normal. I would say that generally speaking, if you notice someone is upset and you're like, oh, you're upset, and then they deny it, is to maybe not get bogged down in the semantics of whether or not they're upset, but you can still listen to them, right? And care for them as a good friend. The Abuse of Amaranth, Part 1. Jordan says, is she not also being trafficked to some degree? He forces her to stream and do OnlyFans, controls her finances, threatens her pets, etc. Is this not a form of sex trafficking as well? Yeah, 100%. It's the definition of it. Allegedly, these things are happening. Good old Hoop Gene says, some people are really criticizing you for covering this. I think because the content is so triggering. I just wanted to add my opinion here that this is really helpful for a lot of people, including myself, even though it is quite difficult to watch. Yeah, yes, difficult to watch. My wife will watch these videos before we post to make sure that everything's looking okay, and she couldn't watch it all the way through. She had to stop it. I think I stopped it a couple times as well. Yeah, it's rough. Although I think of the things that we watch on the internet, of course, people should take care of themselves and not be exposed to these kinds of things. But of the things that we choose to pay attention to, whether it's sports or the news or something, this kind of content, I think, is very important for people to watch, if they can handle it, of course. Because when you see it from the outside, and when you hear an expert who treats perpetrators talking about the hallmarks of abuse, I think it can be helpful, because when you're in a situation like this, or even when you're observing it, if you have a brother that acts like this way with his wife or something, it can be really hard to figure out what's going on, because the abusive person seems so sure of themselves. They seem so confident. They seem so powerful, and they know things, because that's what they're trying to portray. But that's the deception. And so you need to be able to see through it, not so that you can blast them and make fun of them or something, but because you can differentiate. You'd be able to be like, oh, what, instead of trying to engage, and also obviously get to safety. The temptation in a situation like that, when you're being victimized, is to try to work with it. You're trying to help them. You're using your paradigm of communication and relationships to try to make the situation better, but that actually makes it worse for you, because that's exactly what they want. They want you to try to accommodate or understand or deal with it rationally. You can't deal with that behavior rationally. You have to see it in this whole other paradigm. And once you see it that way, there's a much quicker road to being able to get to safety, right? So, and this could happen when you're in public. If you just run into someone that you don't know, a stranger, and they're yelling at you, that's another venue where you can feel like you're supposed to deal with the person rationally. But there are abusive techniques, even among strangers, that if you can identify it, you'll be like, oh, there's no sense in me trying to approach this in the way I would with someone else. You know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily get you to safety, but at the very least, it's quicker to the safety process, because you can identify it as something that it's in its own category, and you don't have to regard it as it's your fault, right? So for Amaranth, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the beginning, maybe she was beyond that point by the time she made that video, but where in the beginning, she'd maybe really try to work with him and be like, okay, well, what do you want me to do? I'm trying it. And we understand, at least the way it looks, is that that's not really what's happening. The abusive person isn't really trying to establish a back and forth or an understanding or a mutual relationship. What they're trying to establish is control, because that's what makes them feel safe. That's what makes them feel better. So, but anyways, yeah, so I understand it's very triggering, and I agree. And also, but I think it's worth it, ethically speaking, as a clinician, I'm always thinking about the benefit versus the risk, right? That's the ethical decision-making process. A lot of people think that ethics in my field are rules, but there's very few rules in my industry as a therapist and as a professor and supervisor. The ethical decision-making process is one in which you, as best as you can, through consultation and reading literature and contemplation, evaluating the benefits versus the risk. So there is a risk to me posting videos like this, obviously, but the benefit, as I have determined in consultation with others, far outweighs that risk, right? The other thing that I was confused about were that people were criticizing me for covering it, which, I saw some of the comments and I couldn't relate. I didn't understand what people were saying. Sometimes I'm like, oh, okay. But with this, I don't know. It just didn't really make a lot of sense to me, because a lot of people were talking about it online and were condemning it. And I thought, well, I'm a clinician. I've treated perpetrators. I've always treated a lot of victims, so I might be able to contextualize some of this. So I didn't understand what the criticism was. Joe B says, her husband sounds like my ex-fiance. Watching Dr. Honda's videos helped me realize that my relationship was toxic. Thank you, Dr. Honda. Yeah, so that's what I was talking about earlier, that when you're in it, it's hard to see it for what it is, especially if it's verbal like this. If it's physical, it's easier to detect, because there's a discrete difference between not hitting someone and hitting someone. Whereas in a marriage, there's always people that are upset. You're always going to be upset at your partner. That's just always going to happen. And people are going to get intense, maybe even raise their voice, maybe even call each other names at times, which isn't great. But there's a fuzzier line between that normal upsettedness that you're going to see in a healthy-ish relationship and verbal abuse. It's very easy for me to see, because I've treated people and I'm educated in this area, but for the general public, they might have a harder time. So for yourself, Joe, you're saying, watching these videos helped me realize that my relationship was kind of in this category. Prior to watching this video, I didn't really necessarily see it that way. So yeah. Zombie says, I'm so glad you speak about this. Many people online blame her for the abuse because of the content she creates. Yeah, without going into the specifics, after I posted the videos, I saw some of that criticism. People saying like, because, she was a Twitch streamer, I believe, and a lot of the audience were men who were having a fantasy that they would be able to be with her one day, or I don't know. That's the way it seemed to me. Which is fine, but when it was revealed that she was married, they thought they were lied to somehow, that they were being exploited as customers because she was giving off a vibe that she was single. I don't know. I mean, it's like... But, and even if you had that feeling, it's like, well, okay, but at the same time, so that eclipses what's happening. This individual, this human being is being, dehumanization, misogyny, it's all real. And I imagine that a lot of people, I don't know, but I'm just going to take a guess and say that a good portion of her audience were just absolute misogynistic, sexist, red pill people, because there's a sort of Venn diagram with that group and gaming and Twitch, and that toxicity, I'm sure, was highly prevalent. But from what I understand, because I've been reading other stuff about the story, that she has been receiving a lot of support as well. Lou says, to be honest, I struggle with yelling too much with my partners. It's taken me years. So I love when people comment like this when it's one thing to be able to say like, wow, I went through that kind of abuse, which I absolutely appreciate. It's kind of on another level for someone to watch this and say, oh my God, I'm like that abusive person. To be able to admit that internally and to post it, to comment on it is huge. It doesn't make the abuse okay, but it's a step in the direction of healing, of morality, of apologizing to people in your past, of preventing yourself from being abusive in the future. And so Lou says, to be honest, I struggle with yelling too much with my partners. It's taken me years to learn to communicate in a healthy way, and I'm still working. As a child, my parent yelled at me frequently. Right, so just chiming in here, people almost always learn this. If not always, it's modeled to them. I never thought of myself as abusive, but it's a possibility. The main issue is when I'm yelling, it's almost like my brain turns off completely. Then I realize I don't really mean anything I'm saying. I realize that's just the way I was taught to communicate. Yeah. Abusive Amaranth, Part 3. Erica says, thank you for covering this, even though you get trolled. This will save lives. Your brain gets scrambled when you go through abuse. Learning about narcissism and psychopathy from this channel has freed me. I'm glad, Erica. I mean, I'm sad you went through that, obviously. Raquel says, I really love and appreciate your take on many topics, but this has been the best series of reaction videos you have ever made. I think your perspective on how abusers behave and why is so compelling and important for people to be aware of. Yeah, I mean, not to toot my own horn, but a lot of the discourse on the internet regarding abusive individuals it's not terrible, it's not bad, but it lacks nuance. And there's this tendency that will be like, that's an abusive, malignant, narcissistic, psychopathic person. They're a sociopath. They're almost like treated like a different species of human. But abusive people are not a different species of human. They are regular humans, and they have regular defenses that lead to horrible behavior. We're all kind of on that spectrum. If you've ever yelled at your partner or called your partner a name to their face, like, or you swore in their face, like, you effing jerk, it's abusive. The point is I want people to understand that it's not a different species. One, because people, when they are abusive, like Lou was going, oh my God, I think I'm abusive. If we label them all as this weird psychopathic group of people that have no empathy, then the abusers of the world who do have empathy, and in my experience, most abusers do absolutely have empathy, they will say, well, that's not me, so I must be off the hook here. So we have to be more realistic and science-based and nuanced when we're talking about abusive people, so that abusive people can actually be like, ooh, I think that's me. The other thing is that when we meet people and we're dating them and we're like, oh my God, this person has a lot of empathy, because some abusers have a lot of empathy. It's not incredibly uncommon for there to be a couple and the victim will say, my abusive partner actually has more empathy than I do. They care about our children and the pets and the world and me more than I care about them. but they're also abusive. So to be able to understand that the reality of abuse, also to be able to understand where it comes from is important. Also to understand what the abusive person is trying to achieve, because often in the discourse they'll say like, well, they just want control, and that's sort of the end of the conversation. They're in it for control, and there's some wisdom to framing it that way, but I don't find that to be very helpful. And I remember when I was early in my career, I'm like, well, that doesn't really fit with my model of humans. Humans don't just want control, and they don't ruin their lives. Because, abusive people kind of know they are kind of burning down. It's like there's a spider in the house, and they're burning the entire house down because they don't want to deal with the spider. And so it's like, okay, yeah, they want to kill the spider, but why are they resorting to burning the house down, right? And it just never really made sense to me, because all of us want control. We want power. That's normal. But why are they going to that extreme? And they're really shooting themselves in the foot. Why would they do that? And when you understand why commonly people will do that, then I think it makes it so much more understandable and perhaps easier to detect for yourself, and easier to detect in yourself if you are like that. Anyway. All right, so Try Guy's apology reaction video that I posted. So I'm not going to read all the comments, but there were a lot of people telling me about the nuances of the story, which was interesting. But I'll repeat something that I was saying in the apology video, which is, or in the Try Guy's reaction video, is that a lot of the emotion I totally understand, and I'll never really understand because I didn't even know about this channel until this scandal came out. So I'm not going to feel it. I don't know these people. I haven't followed them. They've been around a long time, and for a lot of people, these individuals are like family to them, and I totally understand that, and there's nothing strange about that. So in the same way that if you found out your dad was cheating on your mom, that would be very, very disruptive, and it could feel very similar to that. So all that is normal. Obviously, the team being upset and sad and angry is also normal because their whole life is now disrupted. People being upset that for the individuals, for the kids, for Ned's wife, worrying about exploitation to the subordinate, all that is good. It's wonderful. Rewind the clock 20 years ago, I don't know if people would have cared or would have known to care. So I think we've really come a long way in terms of our awareness of exploitation, of sexism in the workplace, and that's all 100% positive. The thing that I was providing commentary on and a little bit of nuance to is that people get into messy situations and infidelity happens. It's not good. My take on infidelity. I find that a lot of therapists will give cheaters a pass, especially if it's their client. An individual client comes in and says, I'm cheating on my partner, and anecdotally, I'll see a lot of therapists will say like, well, there must be a good reason. Your partner must be a jerk face. And I'm just like, that could be true, but 9 times out of 10, that is not the entire story. The person cheating is doing something really awful. They're deceiving, they're lying. Cheating is morally wrong most of the time. It's lying. It's hurtful. It's a choice. And it's not just something you fall into. You make thousands of little choices to lead down a road that eventually leads to cheating. So it's not okay. And at the same time, a lot of people do it, and it happens. And it doesn't mean that we see those people as irredeemable or awful human beings. In the comments, people were saying he was portraying himself as this wonderful father figure, as this loving husband, as this good person. I think someone was saying he even had videos on like how to live in a good marriage and this sort of thing. And now we're learning it's completely different. Those things can actually live in the same universe. He could be a loving husband. He could love his wife. He could be a great father. And he could be cheating. Those two things can exist in the same person. But in our society, that's not how we frame it. Similar to the way we will see abusers as another species, we will see cheaters as another species. They're not. Cheaters are not a different species. A lot of people cheat. And again, it's not okay. But it doesn't mean that everything he was saying wasn't true. I've had clients who were in the midst of a beautiful, wonderful, loving, supportive marriage, and they were cheating. The cheating reasons are complicated. It doesn't make it okay. And I was there as a therapist saying, it's not okay. You're deceiving your partner. I'm not going to tell on you, but I'm not going to beat around the bush. You're doing something that's wrong, and you're deceiving, and make a choice, essentially. Figure this out. Because I remember thinking that. I remember when I was younger, I remember having a kind of a black and white point of view about this kind of behavior, that this kind of behavior was the dirty, wrong people. Those are the people that did those sorts of things. And us over here, we would never do anything like that. And, you grow up and you learn differently. That's my point. And I think I was trying to offer that up partially because if there were fans of the Try Guys, I wanted to offer another option for people to be like, well, maybe my love for Ned and his family wasn't misguided. Maybe it's more complicated than that. Big Ed 47, Holly says, Liz ran off because she knew Ed would not give her space otherwise. My ex-husband was like this. So yeah, when Liz walked off, I pretty quickly hypothesized that it was not because of the discrete moment, but because of what she knew she was heading into, because of the tone of his voice and the accusation of jealousy. And she very quickly realized, oh, no, I'm not going to do this right now. So Holly is saying that would happen to her. He couldn't take no for an answer, or not right now, or let's take a break and talk about this later. I would have to leave to get some space. One time, I locked myself in the bedroom and he busted through the door, breaking the door frame. Yikes. I then got in my car, drove to a spot where I could sleep in my car. I didn't want to call a friend or family because I didn't want people to know how bad things would get. My ex isn't a bad person, just has a lot of issues and an alcohol problem. Yeah. I'm sorry you went through that, but I'm glad you're no longer in it. Big Ed 48, Madison says, as a bisexual woman, I have experienced an abusive relationship with a man who was very cagey about me spending time with people of all genders. So this whole scene feels very familiar to me. It is homophobia and biphobia, pure and simple. Yeah, agreed. It's also worth noting that this is similar to an accusation that Ed made against Rose at the tell-all, where he was angry that she was dating a woman after him, essentially outing her. It seems like something he's really fixated on. Yeah. So yeah, it is a clear pattern of his. And part of homophobia and biphobia is, that phobia part is, it's just a fear of the whole thing. It's just like, oh, it's scary. I don't understand. And the fear is based on all these stereotypes and ridiculousness and assumptions of hypersexuality. There's this, and I sort of forget this because it was so long ago when this was much more prevalent, that there was this assumption that if you weren't heterosexual, you were constantly thinking about sex all the time. I think I even talked about this in the video. But anyway, my point is that, yeah, it's pretty awful and it's pretty prevalent. And it's fairly threatening to men in particular, right? Because for many men, they want to be possessive. They're ultimately very insecure deep down. Catherine says, wow, I have been watching Psychology in Seattle since early 2020, and I am still learning new things. I have experienced emotional abuse, and I ran away just like Liz did. And having Dr. Kirk spell it out as a common reaction to abuse was very powerful for me. It really is so true how abusers berate you and break you down, and you just try to bypass the whole thing by just running away. So very sad. Yeah, I'm glad you found that validation, Catherine, because if you are a Liz in a situation like that, if you're like Liz, you can end up feeling like you're the petty one or the immature one, because that's obviously what the abusive person is shoving down your throat. But you can often feel pretty out of control and inept because you're thinking, how come I can't face it, or how come I can't deal with it, or what's going on with me? All I know is that I needed to run away, and I did. And sometimes you might be in your wedding dress, a little intoxicated, running down the street trying to get away from people, because it's the only option. You don't have it. What was Liz supposed to do? Like engage with him on that issue? She knew that where this was headed, and we saw where it was headed, right? It wasn't headed anywhere good. Anyway, Big Ed 49, Deirdre says, I am just mostly worried about Liz's daughter seeing their dynamic. Yeah, it's hard to know what the daughter is being exposed to. I feel like a lot of people are assuming, not you, Deirdre, but Some people are assuming things. It's hard to believe that the child wouldn't be witnessing something, but we just don't know. Layla says, Ed was the one who cheated on his ex, and my assumption is that he's internalized his own disloyalty and guilt, and in turn is now afraid that everyone else who's with him will do that to him. Layla, that's a very astute analysis. I had forgotten that he was the one who cheated on his ex. He has to have some kind of abandonment trauma, though, himself. So, I mean, he did have an abusive father, or at least a stern father. So that can feel like a rejection when you're being abused. But so he cheated on his ex, and he might be internalizing this, and so this is an actual projection. People will use projection in this other context when they're actually meaning displacement or transference. This is an actual projection where you have an aspect of the self that you are very ashamed of and upset about, and so you will project it onto other people and attack it. You're really attacking yourself for an aspect of yourself, but it's too intolerable, so you'll project that aspect onto someone else and attack it somewhere else. And so that's a common thing. You know, we can think of Angela along these lines. She's the one that is cheating, seemingly. Michael, there's no evidence that he's doing that, yet Angela is absolutely attacking Michael, assuming that he's cheating when she's the one cheating. And people keep telling her that. Her daughter is telling her that. And Angela just can't see it because of the need to project. And people will project mainly because they lack ego strength and maturity and differentiation. And so, anyway, Angela and Michael, speaking of, number 38, Shake Buttercup says, I've never been so triggered by a person on a television show before, but I honestly feel so upset seeing Angela attack and degrade Michael. It turns my stomach from how poorly she treats him. Yeah. Yes. I don't know if I've been as triggered by a person on television before either. I mean, this was, yeah. And it was so prolonged. I mean, these scenes of her doing this kind of thing and the degree of it. And yes, and it's interesting. And again, similar to Amaranth, it's, I think, educational to be able to see it. Because if you're in that experience or you're in that direction, it's hard to analyze, right? It's hard to see it for what it is. And you might try to deal with it of just like, okay, well, because what the abusive person is hoping for is that you will engage like a normal human being, meaning that you will say, okay, you're upset at me. How do I make you not upset at me? That's how they get their hooks into you. But if you don't engage, like the way Amaranth wasn't really engaging, she wasn't giving in. She did kind of by, because he kept telling her to shut up and she eventually stopped talking. But the individual is not trying to work something out. They're trying to establish control. They're trying to establish, you will do what I tell you to do. Not only, is Angela saying, close down your Instagram, but also you are not going to talk. You are not allowed to talk. You aren't allowed to think. I am allowed to think. I'm allowed to talk. I'm allowed to get big. I'm allowed to get over you. You are not allowed to do that. And that's what they're trying to do. And so if you're trying to appease them, if you're trying to be, okay, clearly I did something wrong. How do I get you to not be upset at me? If you're in that zone and that's all you're trying to do, which is normal, that's what works with most other people, is you will give up power and control over and over and over again. And before long, you have no power, you have no control, and you're gaslit, and you don't even think that you have any right to push back, And so for us to watch this, it's, I think, helpful to be able to identify if people can handle it. Yeah, but yeah, it was very, very triggering, very, very hard to watch, very, very upsetting. Midas says, Rose is doing extremely well. Yeah, I think I might have said something like, last I heard, Rose was trying to be an influencer, and I was curious. So Midas is saying that Rose is doing extremely well. She is a YouTuber and Instagram star. She is doing so well, she bought a farm for her family, a house, and started her own business. I'm so proud of her. Yeah, that gives me chills. Thank you. That's just wonderful because, yeah, bought a farm for her family. That sounds really lovely. Sherry says, it's interesting that Angela and Kimberly seemingly have the same trigger for throwing drinks in people's faces. Angela and Kim both consider being laughed at the highest form of disrespect. It seems like Angela and Kim have the same schema. Yeah, Sherry, that's very, very intelligent of you, very, very astute. I was thinking a similar thing, and I think I'll be posting a video along those lines where I mention that, where it seems as though they both have humiliation trauma and are triggered along those lines, and their defense is to humiliate. To splash something in someone else's face is an act of humiliate. You're trying to humiliate the individual, right? At least it seems like a common motivation for that. Now, I will say that it seems Kimberly is not as bad and doesn't have as many traumas, but yeah, it has a similar flavor to it for sure. Angela and Michael, number 39. Liz says, my mother behaves like Angela. I behaved this way too as a teenager and young adult until I realized this was not the only way. I can attest to the trauma of it lasting a long time. I am still jumpy because of what my mom put me through. And when I hear things fall and crash, or even if someone stomps too hard when they walk, I get jumpy, among other things. Yeah, Liz, what you're describing is a classic symptom of PTSD, perhaps complex PTSD. I don't know if you suffer from that, but to have a overreactive response, a very quick startle response is what we call it, is a classic neurological sign that you suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you get treatment, that symptom, among many others, are potentially alleviated. So I would get treatment. F says, with someone that specializes in it, F says, coming from a family who acts like this, acts like Angela, I've always tried to brush it off as it not being that bad. This episode really hits home. I remember what I felt in those moments so vividly. I love your videos, Dr. Kirk. Please keep doing what you're doing. Amazing. Yeah, I imagine for a lot of people, and I think I might have mentioned this in the video, that when you're watching this, you're just like, oh my God, I've seen that before. And I'm having that feeling again, where even though I'm not in the room, I'm watching Angela on a TV screen, I have that physiological reaction that I know very, very well. So yeah, and when you're in a family like that, you will absolutely, 99.9% of people anecdotally, will decide that it's normal. Well, one, because it is normal because you're born into that family, but also because it's so much harder to deal with if you know that it is effed up. Because if you know that it's effed up, then you will want it to be different and you'll feel transgressed upon. It'll be more acute, the feelings that you're having. And you might even react against it at times impulsively. You're being yelled at, you'll just be like, you're abusive. And when you do that, you might get more abuse, right? So it's so much easier. It's a lesser of two evils, obviously, but it's so much easier to just be like, this must be normal, right? You know, every parent gets angry sometimes. That's okay. My parent is just really fiery or something. And this is normal. And what I'm experiencing is normal. And this feeling I'm having is normal. And that normalization is throughout the whole family and potentially in the culture and the community. And it takes a long time to emerge out of that kind of self-gaslighting in a sense, right? It's self-brainwashing and maybe even brainwashed by the family. And once you can emerge from that, you can say, oh, what I went through was not normal and not okay and not about me. It wasn't my fault. I'm affected by it, but I didn't have anything to do with it. That was on them. I was a victim throughout that whole process. That's an important step in recovery. And so I'm glad that you were, you're able to notice. It's just like, yeah. So you're saying you came from a family who acted like this and you always tried to brush it off as it not being that bad. But when you're watching the video, you're just like, no, from the outside, that's bad. And that's what I was going through. But if I were in the room experiencing that, I'd be trying to convince myself that that's normal. But I can't see it as normal now if I'm looking at it from afar. And that's a part of recovery. And I'm glad that you're able to do that, F. Well, that does it for that. This is a rough week. There was so much abuse. I mean, right? You got Amaranth, you got Donald Trump, you got Big Ed, and you got Angela. Oof. Like, it's a lot. So I'll check in with myself. Well, you can check in with yourself. How's your shoulders? How's your neck? How's your chest? How's your stomach? How are those head muscles doing? Okay. Back of the neck, back of the head. Are your feet on the ground? How's your breathing? How's your heart rate? Everything okay? Are we okay? Are we okay? We're okay. These are people on the television. Real people going through real stuff, and it's tough. And we have our people. I have my wife. I have my friends. I have my family. I have you. You have me. You have your people. Focus on our protective attachment circle. Internet hug. Consensual internet hug. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.